The weight of the past. Andrew Patterson strolled through the bustling Chicago O'Hare Airport, his steps brisk but heavy. It was early morning, and the terminal buzzed with the chaotic energy of travelers rushing to their gates. Clad in an impeccably tailored suit and clutching the sleek leather briefcase, Andrew checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. He hated business trips, despite the wealth and prestige they had afforded him over the years. Success had come at a cost he was only now starting to reckon with. As he approached his gate, Andrew's thoughts wandered back to Vanessa, his second wife. Attractive, polished, and driven, she had been the perfect complement to his ambitions when they first met. But after years of living in a world of deals, mergers, and acquisitions, something about his life felt shallow. He often found himself haunted by a distant emptiness he couldn't quite name. Just then, the flicker of movement in his peripheral vision made Andrew's breath catch in his throat. He turned and saw her, a woman with chestnut hair pulled into a casual ponytail, walking with the easy grace that seemed so familiar it hurt. In an instant, Andrew was transported back a decade to a time before his corporate empire, before the wealth, to a simpler life. Sarah. He muttered under his breath, stunned. It couldn't be her. But it was. Sarah, his first wife. The woman he had left without so much as a goodbye face to face. The woman he had loved but abandoned in pursuit of a life he thought he wanted. His heart raced as he took in the sight of her, after all these years, still beautiful, still radiating that quiet strength. But it wasn't just seeing Sarah that left Andrew frozen in place. It was the boy at her side. The child, no more than 10 years old, looked up at Sarah with a bright smile, and for the briefest moment, Andrew felt as though he was staring at a younger version of himself. The boy had the same blonde hair, unruly and windswept. His eyes, a deep emerald green, mirrored Andrew's exactly. Andrew's pulse quickened. He could barely process what he was seeing. Could it be? He stumbled forward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Time seemed to slow as Andrew watched the two of them disappear into the crowd. His mind raced back to that fateful day 10 years ago. He had left Sarah with nothing but a cold, brief note on the kitchen table, telling her he was moving on. He had been too cowardly to face her, too selfish to stay. He wanted more out of life, more than what their quiet marriage and modest lifestyle offered. Now, looking at the boy, a shocking thought hit him like a freight train. Had Sarah been pregnant when he left? Was that boy his son? Andrew's hands trembled as he pushed his way through the crowd, eyes locked on Sarah and the boy as they moved toward a gate at the far end of the terminal. He could barely think straight. I need to talk to her. I need to know. But the crowd thickened. Travelers swarmed in all directions, and with every step Andrew took, it seemed like Sarah, and the boy drifted further and further away. Sarah, he called out, his voice swallowed by the cacophony of the airport. When he finally reached the gate, they were gone. Andrew stood there, panting, heart pounding in his chest, feeling as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He looked around frantically, scanning the faces in the terminal, hoping for one more glimpse of the past he thought he had buried for good. But Sarah had vanished. For a moment, Andrew just stood there, frozen, lost. A flight attendant at the gate gave him a polite smile. "Sir, are you boarding?" she asked, noticing his disheveled state. Andrew blinked, his mind racing. The boarding call for his flight sounded over the intercom, but he barely heard it. In his head, all he could see was Sarah's face, her soft smile, the look in her eyes, and the boy. That boy, who looked just like him. Was it possible? Could that be his son? Andrew didn't answer the attendant. Instead, he turned and walked away from the gate, the world around him fading into a blur. His phone buzzed in his pocket, Vanessa's name flashing on the screen, but he ignored it. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. Not his flight, not his business deals. Nothing except finding out the truth. Sarah had disappeared from his life once before, and he wasn't about to let her vanish again. Backstory: the choice that changed everything. 10 years earlier, Andrew had been a different man. Fresh-faced, full of ambition, and determined to build a life of success. He had loved Sarah. Truly, she had been his world in the early years of their marriage. A schoolteacher, Sarah had a warmth about her, a compassion that drew him in from the very first time they met. But as Andrew climbed the corporate ladder, the simplicity of their life began to feel like a burden. Then came Vanessa. Vanessa was the embodiment of everything Andrew thought he wanted: sophisticated, driven, connected. She moved in circles of power and influence, promising Andrew a life of luxury that Sarah could never provide. It wasn't long before Andrew found himself in hotel bars with Vanessa, discussing dreams of wealth and power, while Sarah was back home, oblivious to the emotional distance growing between them. On a crisp fall night, Andrew made the decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He wrote Sarah a letter, cold and final. He couldn't look her in the eyes as he left. He couldn't bear to see the hurt in her face. "I need more from life than you can give me," the letter had said. He had convinced himself it was the right choice. He was chasing his dreams. But standing in the airport, watching the woman he had abandoned walk away with a child that might be his, Andrew felt the full weight of his mistake crash down on him. Present day. The search for redemption. Andrew exited the airport in a daze, hailing a cab to the only place he could think of: the office of his old college friend, Frank, a private investigator who owed him a favor. As the cab sped toward downtown Chicago, Andrew's mind raced. He had spent the last decade building a fortune, becoming a name in the business world, but none of it mattered now. "Frank, it's Andrew. I need your help," he said when Frank answered the phone. "Andrew, it's been years. What's going on?" Frank sounded surprised. "I need you to find someone for me. Her name is Sarah. Sarah Thompson. She was my wife." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay, I'll see what I can do, but you better tell me the whole story when we meet," Frank replied, his voice tinged with concern. Andrew closed his eyes, running a hand through his hair. Where would he even begin? For the first time in 10 years, Andrew Patterson didn't feel like a powerful businessman. He felt like a man on the verge of losing something far more precious than money could ever buy. And he knew, deep down, that this was his one chance to make things right. Facing the past. The late afternoon sun bathed the bustling streets of Chicago in a golden glow as Andrew Patterson sat hunched over in a corner booth of a small cafe, staring blankly at his phone. His mind was elsewhere, back at the airport, replaying the moment he saw Sarah after all those years. More importantly, replaying the image of the boy who might be his son. His hand clenched into a fist as the weight of his past mistakes hung over him like a dark cloud. Frank, the private investigator he had hired, had promised to gather as much information as possible on Sarah's current life, and Andrew's phone was constantly buzzing with updates. Still, he felt powerless, waiting for someone else to give him the answers he so desperately needed. Andrew's reflection in the window of the cafe revealed a man who looked much older than his 45 years. His eyes were weary, his face drawn with the exhaustion of regret. He had spent years building a life of success, climbing the corporate ladder, achieving financial wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But now, none of it seemed to matter. All the money in the world couldn't erase the mistakes of his past, and now, for the first time in a long time, he was forced to confront the choices that had led him here. Andrew's phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his reverie. It was Frank, and this time it wasn't another text. It was a call. "Andrew, I've got something." Frank's voice came through the speaker, steady but with an edge of hesitation. "I've been digging into Sarah's life over the past few days, and I think I've found what you're looking for." Andrew's heart leaped into his throat. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse with anticipation. "She's living on the north side, in a small neighborhood near Ravenswood. She's been there for a few years now. The boy, Ethan, is his name. He's 10, just like you suspected. And Andrew, I think he's your son." Andrew sat back, closing his eyes as the enormity of Frank's words washed over him. Ethan. His son. He had a son. The world suddenly felt like it was spinning out of control. "There's something else," Frank continued cautiously. "She's not alone. She's been in a relationship for the past couple of years with a man named Mark Wilson. He's a teacher, like Sarah. By all accounts, they're serious." A dull ache settled in Andrew's chest. Of course, Sarah would have moved on. She deserves to. He had no right to feel jealousy, no right to feel anything. After all, he had been the one to walk away, leaving her to face the hardships of life alone. "And Ethan?" Andrew asked, barely able to force the words out. Does he know about me?" Frank hesitated. "From what I can tell him, no. Sarah never mentioned you to him. As far as Ethan is concerned, Mark is the father figure in his life." The words hit Andrew like a punch to the gut. His son had grown up without knowing him. Ethan had likely never wondered about the man who left before he was born. To him, Mark was the man who had stepped in, who had been there for all the moments Andrew had missed. Andrew slumped forward, his head in his hands. How could he possibly make up for the years he had lost? How could he explain his actions to a boy who had never known his existence? "I need to see them," Andrew muttered under his breath. Frank's voice came through clear, but with caution. "Are you sure about this? You can't just waltz back into their lives after all this time. You need to think about the impact this will have on them, on Sarah, on Ethan. You don't want to disrupt everything." Andrew knew Frank was right. His return would turn their world upside down. But the overwhelming guilt and the need for redemption gnawed at him relentlessly. "I can't just walk away again," he thought. "I don't have a choice, Frank," Andrew said firmly. "I need to see my son, the quiet life Sarah built." Across town, in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, Sarah Thompson was busy preparing dinner, her mind drifting as she absent-mindedly stirred the pot on the stove. The kitchen was cozy, filled with warm lighting and the comforting smell of homemade soup. It was a far cry from the life she had shared with Andrew years ago, but it was the life she had built from the ground up, after the devastation he had left behind. In the living room, Ethan sat on the floor, engrossed in a puzzle, his messy blonde hair falling into his eyes. Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride and love. He was everything to her, the reason she had fought so hard to rebuild her life when everything had fallen apart. But lately, something had been nagging at her. Ever since that day at the airport when she had caught a glimpse of a man who looked eerily like Andrew, Sarah had felt uneasy. She had tried to shake the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the encounter had stirred memories she had long buried. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly wiped her hands on a towel, heading toward the entryway. Mark stood on the other side, a warm smile on his face, holding a bottle of wine. "Hey, beautiful," he greeted her, leaning in to kiss her on the cheek. Sarah smiled, grateful for his presence. Mark had been a rock for her and Ethan over the past few years, his steady kindness and unwavering support a balm to her wounded heart. He wasn't Andrew. He didn't have Andrew's ambitious drive or magnetic charm, but that was a good thing. Mark was stable, reliable, and most importantly, he loved Ethan as if he were his own. "Dinner smells amazing," Mark said, glancing over her shoulder toward the stove. "How was your day?" Same old," Sarah replied, trying to keep her tone light. But Mark could sense her unease. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. Sarah hesitated. She hadn't told Mark about seeing Andrew at the airport. She wasn't even sure if it had really been him. It had been so many years since she last saw Andrew. Perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. "I'm fine," Sarah said quickly, flashing him a smile. "Just a bit tired, that's all." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced, but he didn't push the issue. Instead, he turned his attention to Ethan, who was still engrossed in his puzzle. "How's the puzzle coming along, buddy?" Mark asked, ruffling Ethan's hair as he passed by. Ethan looked up with a wide grin. "Almost done. Wanna help?" Mark sat down beside him, and the two quickly became absorbed in the puzzle, their quiet conversation filling the room with a sense of calm. Sarah watched them, her heart full, yet her mind still distracted by thoughts of the past. Andrew's next move. That evening, Andrew found himself sitting in his car, parked a few houses down from Sarah's address. The street was quiet, the kind of suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where children played in front yards and neighbors exchanged pleasantries on the sidewalk. It was a far cry from the world Andrew had surrounded himself with, an endless cycle of high-stakes business meetings, expensive dinners, and luxury hotels. From his vantage point, Andrew could see the house Frank had described. It was small, modest, but well-kept, with a swing in the front yard and a child's bike leaning against the porch. His heart ached as he thought of Ethan living in that house, growing up without him, while another man filled the role Andrew had abandoned. What was he even doing here? Andrew had no plan, no idea what he would say if he saw Sarah or Ethan. He just knew he couldn't stay away. As the hours passed, Andrew watched the lights inside the house flicker on, and soon enough, he saw them. Sarah, Ethan, and Mark, through the front window. They were sitting together at the dining table, laughing, talking. A family. A happy family. Andrew's breath hitched as he realized just how much he had missed. The boy, his son, was growing up without him. And Sarah, she had moved on. She was no longer the woman he had left behind, broken and devastated. She had rebuilt her life, found someone who loved her in Ethan. And yet, here he was, lurking in the shadows of a life he had walked away from. He knew he couldn't keep sitting in his car, hiding from the truth. With a deep breath, Andrew opened the door and stepped out onto the quiet street. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the house, unsure of what he would say, unsure of what he even wanted. As he reached the sidewalk in front of the house, Andrew paused, taking in the sight of Sarah and Ethan through the window one last time. He knew he had no right to disrupt their lives, no right to ask for forgiveness, but he had to try. He had to make things right, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. An unwelcome reunion. The soft hum of the crickets filled the quiet air as Andrew Patterson stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the modest house that contained his past, and perhaps his future. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: guilt, regret, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. He had spent 10 years running from the consequences of his decisions, and now, standing in front of the life he had left behind, he wondered if he was too late. Andrew's fingers twitched at his sides as he contemplated the door just a few feet away. Behind it were Sarah and Ethan, his son, the boy he had never known, the boy who had grown up without him. His legs felt like lead, his breath shallow, as he tried to summon the courage to take that final step toward the door. Before he could make a decision, the front door swung open. There she was, Sarah. The sight of her hit Andrew like a sledgehammer to the chest. Her face had changed slightly in the decade since he had last seen her. She had aged. There were a few more lines around her eyes, and her hair was a bit shorter than he remembered. But she was still the same woman who had once been his entire world. The woman he had loved. The woman he had betrayed. Sarah had stepped out onto the porch to water the plants, but the instant she saw him, she froze, her eyes widening in shock. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at each other in stunned silence, the years and the miles between them suddenly evaporating. Andrew. She finally breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to find something, anything, to say. But what could he say? How could he explain his presence here after all this time? Before he could respond, the shock on Sarah's face turned to anger. She set the watering can down with a sharp clank and marched down the steps toward him, her eyes blazing with fury. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and hurt. "After all these years, you just show up out of nowhere." Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tight. I saw you." "At the airport," he stammered. "I didn't know you'd be there. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Sarah cut him off, crossing her arms over her chest. "Didn't know I existed. Didn't know that I still had a life after you walked out on me." Andrew flinched at the sharpness in her tone. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I know I made a terrible mistake. I know I hurt you. But when I saw you, and the boy, I had to know. Is he?" "Yes," Sarah snapped before he could finish the question. "Ethan is your son. The son you abandoned before he was even born." The words hit Andrew like a physical blow, and he staggered backward, his heart aching with the truth he had long feared. He had a son he had never known, a son who had grown up without him. The guilt that had been festering inside him for years now felt unbearable. "I didn't know," Andrew said, his voice barely a whisper. "If I had known, I would have stayed." Sarah's expression darkened, and she took a step closer, her voice low and cold. "Don't lie to yourself, Andrew. You wouldn't have stayed. You wanted out of our life. You wanted something bigger, something more glamorous. You were never satisfied with what we had. You left because you were selfish, and nothing would have changed that." Andrew felt the sting of her words but didn't argue. She was right. He had wanted more money, more success, more power, and in his pursuit of those things, he had thrown away the one thing that truly mattered. He had left Sarah alone, pregnant and heartbroken, to chase after a dream that now felt hollow. "I was wrong," Andrew admitted, his voice breaking. "I see that now. I'd spent the last 10 years thinking about it, regretting it. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was blind. I hurt you, and I hurt our son. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make it right." Sarah shook her head, her jaw clenched. "You can't make it right, Andrew. You can't undo the damage you've caused. You weren't there when I needed you. You weren't there for Ethan." Tears welled in Andrew's eyes as he looked at her, the weight of his regret pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. "Please, Sarah, just let me see him. Let me meet my son." For a moment, Sarah's face softened, the anger giving way to the pain she had carried for so long. But then she steeled herself, her expression hardening once more. "No," she said firmly. "You don't get to come back into his life after all this time and expect everything to be fine. Ethan doesn't know you, Andrew. He doesn't even know you exist. And I'm not going to let you turn his world upside down." Andrew felt his heart sink. He had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he could just step back into Sarah and Ethan's lives, that he could somehow repair the damage he had caused. But now, standing here, facing the full weight of his past mistakes, he realized just how much he had lost, and how much he had no right to ask for. "I just want a chance," Andrew pleaded, his voice raw. "Just one chance to be a part of his life. To show him that I've changed, that I'm not the man I used to be." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "I can't let you do that," she said quietly. "Ethan is happy. He has a good life, a stable life. Mark has been a father to him for years. He doesn't need you disrupting that." At the mention of Mark, a pang of jealousy shot through Andrew. Mark, the man who had stepped in to fill the role Andrew had abandoned. The man who had been there for Sarah and Ethan when Andrew wasn't. But he couldn't blame Sarah. He couldn't blame Mark. The only person responsible for the situation was himself. "I understand," Andrew said, his voice barely audible. "But I'm not going to give up. I'll prove to you that I deserve a place in his life." Sarah shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You don't get to decide that, Andrew. You lost that right when you left." Andrew's heart shattered at her words, but he didn't argue. He knew she was right. He had lost the right to call himself Ethan's father the moment he walked out the door all those years ago. "Please, just think about it," Andrew said, his voice trembling. "I'll give you time. I won't push. But please, just consider letting me see him, letting me be a part of his life." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression conflicted. Finally, she sighed, rubbing her temples as if the conversation was draining the last of her energy. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, "but I'm not making any promises." Andrew nodded, grateful for even that small concession. It wasn't much, but it was something. A glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark situation. Without another word, Sarah turned and walked back up the steps to the house, leaving Andrew standing alone on the sidewalk. As she reached the door, she paused for a moment, her hand resting on the doorknob. She didn't look back at him, but Andrew could sense the weight of the decision she was wrestling with. Then, the door closed, and Andrew was left alone in the fading light of the evening. Ethan's world. Inside the house, Sarah leaned against the closed door, her heart racing. She hadn't expected to see Andrew again, and the sight of him standing on her front lawn had stirred up emotions she had long buried. Anger, hurt, regret, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. She had spent the last decade rebuilding her life after Andrew left. It hadn't been easy, especially after finding out she was pregnant with Ethan. There had been nights when she had cried herself to sleep, terrified of what the future would hold for her and her unborn child. But she had made it through. She had built a life for herself and for Ethan, and Mark had been a part of that life for the last few years. Mark had been there for Ethan from the time he was small, taking on the role of father without hesitation. He had been patient, kind, and loving, never once questioning his place in their lives. To Ethan, Mark was his dad, the only father he had ever known. And Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to disrupt that. But now, with Andrew back in the picture, everything felt uncertain again. Ethan was in the living room, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place outside. He was still working on his puzzle, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to fit the last piece in place. Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with love. How could she possibly explain any of this to him? How could she tell him that the man he thought of as his father wasn't his biological father? How could she introduce Andrew into his life without causing confusion and pain? As Sarah stood there, lost in thought, Mark came up behind her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "That man outside, that was Ethan's father," she said quietly, the words hanging heavily in the air. Mark's expression faltered, surprise and concern flashing across his face. "Andrew." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He wants to meet Ethan." Mark's brow furrowed, and he looked toward the living room where Ethan was still playing. "What are you going to do?" Sarah shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know." Andrew's determination. As Andrew drove back to his hotel that night, his mind raced with the events of the evening. Seeing Sarah again had been harder than he had imagined. Hearing her say that Ethan didn't know about him, that Ethan thought Mark was his father, had been devastating. But he couldn't walk away. Not again. He had made a promise to himself, and to Ethan, even if the boy didn't know it yet. He was going to find a way back into his son's life, no matter how long it took. He owed that much to Ethan, and to Sarah. But as he pulled into the hotel parking lot, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. How do you make amends for a decade of mistakes? The shadows of the past. Andrew Patterson had never felt so conflicted. As he lay on the stiff hotel bed that night, staring at the ceiling, his mind wouldn't stop racing. The sound of the city outside filtered through the window, but he hardly noticed. All he could think about was the conversation with Sarah, and the revelation that his son, had no idea he existed. Ethan didn't know him. He had never known him. He had grown up with another man filling the role Andrew had so recklessly abandoned. And for that, Andrew's guilt gnawed at him with relentless force. How was he supposed to enter Ethan's life now, after all these years? Could he even justify it? Sarah's words from earlier echoed in his head. You lost that right when you left. She was right, of course. He had forfeited his chance to be a father when he walked out on Sarah all those years ago. He had chosen ambition over family, success over love, and now all of that felt utterly meaningless. For years, he had convinced himself that leaving had been the right choice, that he deserved more than the simple life they had shared. But sitting in that hotel room, thinking about the son he had never known, Andrew felt more hollow than ever. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. He reached for it and saw Vanessa's name flash across the screen. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. His second wife was becoming increasingly impatient with him. He had dodged her calls for days now, too wrapped up in the emotional whirlwind that had overtaken him since seeing Sarah and Ethan at the airport. He knew he needed to talk to Vanessa, to explain why he had missed the business trip, but he couldn't bring himself to face her right now. Not after everything that had happened. He silenced the phone and tossed it back onto the nightstand, running a hand through his hair. Vanessa, the woman who had promised him the world of success and power he thought he wanted, now felt like a distant figure. His mind was consumed by Sarah, Ethan, and the years he had lost. Nothing else seemed to matter anymore. With a groan, Andrew sat up and reached for the notepad on the small table by the bed. He needed to think, to plan his next move. He had promised Sarah he wouldn't push, that he would give her time. But the truth was, he had no idea how to move forward. How do you re-enter the life of a child you abandoned? How do you make up for a decade of silence? It wasn't just about asking for forgiveness, Andrew thought grimly. It was about proving that I could be different. But how? That was the question that plagued him as the hours ticked by. He scribbled a few words on the notepad, trying to organize his thoughts, but everything seemed futile. Sarah had been clear, Ethan was happy, and Mark had been the one to provide the stability Andrew had failed to offer. Who was he to disrupt that now? But the idea of never knowing Ethan, never being a part of his son's life, was something Andrew couldn't bear. Even if Sarah never forgave him, he had to try. For Ethan's sake. The night stretched on, the city outside growing quieter as the hours passed, and as Andrew lay there, restless and unsure, a single thought began to take root in his mind. If I want to prove myself to Sarah and Ethan, I have to start by being present, by showing them that I'm here to stay. Sarah's dilemma. Back on Maple Street, Sarah lay wide awake in bed, staring at the ceiling much like Andrew. The conversation with him earlier had left her shaken. She had never expected to see him again, not after all these years, not after everything that had happened. And now, here he was, back in her life, asking for a chance to meet the son he had never known. Sarah turned onto her side, glancing at the clock on the nightstand. It was late, but sleep was impossible. Mark had gone to bed hours ago, and Ethan was sound asleep in his room down the hall, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm that was brewing in their home. She closed her eyes, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind, but the past wouldn't leave her alone. Memories of Andrew, of the life they had shared before everything fell apart, kept surfacing, unbidden. The laughter, the love, the quiet moments that had once made her feel like they had everything they needed. But then came the discontent. Andrew had grown restless, constantly seeking more success, more recognition, more wealth. And when Vanessa had entered his life, promising him all the things he thought he wanted, he had thrown it all away. He had left Sarah, left the life they had built together, without a second thought. And now, 10 years later, he wanted to come back. He wanted to meet Ethan, to be a part of his life. But how could she allow that? How could she let Andrew into Ethan's world without turning everything upside down? Ethan was happy. He had grown up with Mark, who had been a steady, loving presence in his life from the time he was small. Mark was the man who had been there for him, who had helped him with his homework, who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had cheered him on at his soccer games. Mark was the man Ethan called Dad. What right did Andrew have to disrupt that? But as Sarah lay there, her mind filled with thoughts of Ethan, she couldn't help but feel conflicted. Ethan had a right to know the truth, didn't he? He had a right to know where he came from, to know who his biological father was. Sarah had always planned to tell him one day, but the timing had never felt right. Now, with Andrew back in the picture, everything felt uncertain. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Sarah sit up. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his eyes bleary with sleep, his hair a mess. "Mom," he said, his voice soft. "I had a bad dream." Sarah's heart melted as she opened her arms, and Ethan climbed into bed beside her. She wrapped her arms around him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. He was her world, her reason for everything. She would do anything to protect him, to keep him safe. "What was your dream about, honey?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan snuggled closer to her, his small hands clutching the blanket. "I don't remember," he mumbled, "but it was scary." Sarah held him tightly, her heart aching with the weight of the decision she knew she would have to make soon. How could she ever explain to this sweet, innocent boy that the man he had called Dad all his life wasn't actually his father? How could she tell him that the man who had abandoned them all those years ago wanted to come back into his life? "Everything's okay now," Sarah whispered, stroking Ethan's hair. "I'm here. You're safe." As she held Ethan in her arms, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. Whatever decision she made about Andrew, it would be in Ethan's best interest. She wouldn't let her own pain, her own anger, dictate what happened next. Ethan's happiness was all that mattered now. Mark's quiet strength. The next morning, Mark could sense that something was off. Sarah had been quiet, distant, ever since her encounter with Andrew the night before. He had asked her about it, but she hadn't wanted to talk much, saying only that Ethan's biological father had shown up unexpectedly. Mark didn't push. He had always known there was a possibility that Andrew would come back one day. It was something Sarah had mentioned when they first got serious, a cautionary note in the otherwise steady rhythm of their relationship. But now that it was actually happening, Mark felt a deep sense of unease. He had been there for Ethan since he was 3 years old, and in all that time, Andrew had never been a factor. Ethan was his son in every way that mattered. At least, that's how it felt to Mark. But now, with Andrew back in the picture, everything felt precarious. Would Ethan want to meet Andrew? Would he want to get to know his biological father? And where would that leave Mark? Mark poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Sarah move around the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Ethan. There was a tension in the air, unspoken but palpable, and it was making Mark anxious. "Sarah," he said softly, setting his coffee down on the counter. "You don't have to go through this alone, you know. We can figure it out together." Sarah paused, her hand stilling as she placed a plate of pancakes on the table. She didn't look at him right away, but when she finally did, her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "I just don't know what to do, Mark," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan deserves to know the truth, but what if it ruins everything? What if it confuses him? What if it makes him unhappy?" Mark crossed the room and gently took her hand in his. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it together," he said, his voice steady. "Ethan knows he's loved. That's what matters most." Sarah nodded, grateful for Mark's quiet strength. He had always been her rock, the man who had stepped in when she needed him most. But even as she stood there, holding his hand, her mind couldn't stop thinking about Andrew and the complicated road ahead. Andrew's second chance. Across town, Andrew sat in his hotel room, staring at the piece of paper in front of him. On it were the words he had written the night before, his thoughts, his regrets, his hopes. He had no idea if Sarah would ever give him the chance to meet Ethan, but if she did, Andrew knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to mess it up this time. The door to his past had been cracked open, and for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt like there was a chance, however small, to make things right. He wasn't the same man he had been 10 years ago. He had learned from his mistakes, and now he was determined to prove it. With a deep breath, Andrew picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. The weight of truth. Andrew's hand trembled slightly as he held the phone to his ear, waiting for Sarah to answer. His heart thudded in his chest, each second of silence amplifying his anxiety. He wasn't sure what he would say, wasn't even sure if Sarah would pick up. But he knew he had to try. On the fourth ring, her voice came through, soft but guarded. Andrew. Just hearing her voice again sent a wave of emotions crashing over him, but he swallowed it down, trying to keep his composure. Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to know if we could talk. I understand if you're not ready, but Andrew, she interrupted, her tone firm, but not harsh. I told you I need time. This isn't something I can decide overnight. I know, Andrew said quickly. I know. I'm not trying to rush you. I just wanted to make sure you knew. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, in Chicago, for as long as it takes. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Andrew held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, Sarah sighed. I understand that you want to meet him, she said softly, her voice tinged with the weariness of someone who had carried too much for too long. But this isn't just about you, Andrew. This is about Ethan, his life, his happiness. I need to make sure that whatever decision I make is the right one for him. Andrew nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I get that, and I respect it. I don't want to force anything. I want a chance. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to be a part of his life. There was another long silence, and Andrew could almost hear Sarah's thoughts racing on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, more hesitant. I'll think about it, she said, the words heavy with the weight of uncertainty. But I can't promise anything. Andrew exhaled slowly, relief mingling with apprehension. That's all I ask, he replied softly. Take all the time you need. After a brief, awkward goodbye, Andrew hung up the phone, his emotions swirling in a chaotic mess. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. For the first time in 10 years, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance that he might be able to mend the broken pieces of his past. But the reality of what lay ahead loomed large. Sarah had made it clear that Ethan's well-being was her top priority, and Andrew couldn't fault her for that. He wanted the same thing. The problem was, he wasn't sure how to go about proving to her, or to Ethan, that he could be the father they both deserved. For now, all he could do was wait. A mother's dilemma. Back at the house on Maple Street, Sarah sat in the living room, the phone still in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had never expected Andrew to come back into her life, and now that he had, she was forced to confront a reality she had long avoided. Ethan was 10 years old. For his entire life, he had only known Mark as his father. And now, out of nowhere, Andrew wanted to step back in, as if the past decade hadn't happened. Sarah's gaze drifted to the hallway, where Ethan's backpack sat, discarded after school. He had no idea what was going on, no idea that the man he called Dad wasn't his biological father. How was she supposed to explain it to him? How could she disrupt his world with this truth? The weight of the decision pressed down on her. Mark had been nothing short of a miracle in their lives. He had stepped in without hesitation, loving both her and Ethan with a quiet, steady devotion that had helped heal the wounds Andrew had left behind. Ethan adored him, looked up to him, and in every way that mattered, Mark was his dad. And yet there was Andrew, the man who had abandoned them, the man who had broken her heart, the man who now wanted a second chance to be part of their son's life. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. She had spent the last 10 years doing everything in her power to protect Ethan, to give him the stability and love he needed. Now, with Andrew back, Everything felt precarious, uncertain. The last thing she wanted was to hurt her son. But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. Ethan had a right to know where he came from. He had a right to know who his biological father was, even if that man had failed them both in the past. Still, the thought of telling Ethan the truth, of explaining why Andrew had left, why he had been absent all these years, filled her with dread. She would have to tread carefully. Ethan was a sensitive boy, perceptive beyond his years. If she wasn't careful, the truth could shatter him. As Sarah sat there, lost in thought, Mark walked into the room, his brow furrowed with concern. He had noticed her unease over the past few days, and though she had tried to keep things normal, Mark could sense that something was weighing on her. "Everything okay?" he asked gently, sitting beside her on the couch. Sarah glanced at him, her heart aching with guilt. She had always been honest with Mark, always trusted him with her worries and fears. But this situation with Andrew was different. It felt like a bomb waiting to explode. "I talked to Andrew," she said quietly, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Mark's expression remained neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "What did he say?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "He wants to meet Ethan." Mark didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back against the couch, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the room. Sarah knew what he was thinking, knew that the idea of Andrew coming back into their lives stirred up a lot of complicated emotions. "I don't know what to do, Mark," Sarah admitted, her voice thick with uncertainty. "I want to protect Ethan. I don't want him to be hurt by this, but I can't keep the truth from him forever. He deserves to know." Mark turned to her then, his expression softening. "You're right. Ethan does deserve to know the truth. But it's not just about telling him. It's about making sure he's ready for it. This is going to be a big change for him, and we have to be prepared for how he's going to react." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. I don't want him to feel like everything he's known is a lie." Mark reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "He won't. Ethan is strong, Sarah. He gets that from you, and no matter what happens, he's going to know that he's loved. By both of us." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for Mark in that moment. He had always been her rock, the one who had helped her navigate the difficult waters of single motherhood. Now, as they faced this new challenge, she knew she wasn't alone. Mark would be there, by her side, no matter what. "We'll figure it out," Mark said softly. "Together." The truth unfolds. A few days later, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she watched Ethan play in the backyard. It was a bright Saturday morning, the sun shining down on the patch of grass where Ethan's soccer ball lay. He was kicking it back and forth, lost in his own world, his laughter ringing out every now and then. Sarah's heart clenched. How was she supposed to shatter that innocence with the truth? How was she supposed to tell him that the man he had called Dad wasn't the man who had given him life? Mark walked into the kitchen, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one down in front of Sarah and sat beside her, his expression gentle but serious. "You ready for this?" Sarah nodded, though her stomach was in knots. They had talked it over, decided that it was time to tell Ethan the truth. The conversation with Andrew had weighed on her heavily, and while she still had doubts about letting Andrew meet Ethan, she knew that she couldn't keep the truth hidden any longer. Ethan had a right to know. "I think so," she said quietly, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the mug. Mark gave her a reassuring smile, and for a moment, they sat in silence, watching Ethan play outside. The weight of what they were about to do hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Sarah stood up, taking a deep breath. "I'll go get him." As she walked to the back door, her heart pounded in her chest. When she called Ethan inside, he bounded over, his face flushed with excitement from playing in the sun. "Hey, Mom, look at this cool trick I can do." Ethan exclaimed, spinning the soccer ball on his finger for a moment before it fell to the floor with a clatter. Sarah managed a small smile. "That's great, honey. But can you come sit with us for a minute? We need to talk." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't argue. He walked over to the table and sat down across from his parents, his young face full of curiosity. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, and then Sarah took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was to come. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "there's something important we need to tell you, something you deserve to know." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced between his parents, clearly sensing the seriousness of the moment. "What is it?" Sarah hesitated, her throat tightening. This was it, the moment she had dreaded for so long. But she knew she had to be honest, had to trust that Ethan was strong enough to handle the truth. "Honey," she said gently, reaching for his hand. "The man you call Dad, Mark, he loves you very much, but he's not your biological father." Ethan blinked, his face blank with confusion. "What do you mean?" Sarah's heart ached as she tried to find the right words. "Your biological father, his name is Andrew. He was someone I knew a long time ago, before you were born. He's the man who helped bring you into this world." Ethan stared at her, processing the information slowly. "But I thought Mark was my dad." Mark leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I am your dad, Ethan. I've always been your dad, and nothing's going to change that." Ethan looked at Mark, his expression a mix of confusion and uncertainty. "Then, who's Andrew?" Sarah swallowed hard, her emotions swirling. "Andrew is the man who gave you life, but he wasn't around when you were born. He left before you were born, but now he wants to meet you." Ethan's eyes grew wide, and he stared at Sarah, trying to understand. Why wasn't he here? Sarah felt her throat tighten as tears welled in her eyes. "It's complicated, sweetheart. He made some mistakes, but he's back now, and he wants to meet you, if you're okay with that." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his young mind struggling to process the information. Finally, he looked at Mark, his voice small. "Does this mean you're not my dad anymore?" Mark's heart broke at the question, and he quickly shook his head. "No, buddy. I'll always be your dad, no matter what." Ethan nodded slowly, but the confusion and hurt lingered in his eyes. Sarah reached out, pulling him into her arms, holding him tightly as her own tears slipped down her cheeks. They had told him the truth, but the hardest part was yet to come. The final reckoning. The truth had finally been spoken, but the air in the house felt thick with the weight of it. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her arms wrapped around Ethan, who clung to her with a mix of confusion and sadness. Mark sat quietly across from them, his face etched with concern, but also with a deep, unwavering love. He had promised Sarah they would face this together, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter what. But even with Mark's support, Sarah knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Telling Ethan the truth had been difficult enough, but now came the next step, the one she had been dreading since Andrew first reappeared in their lives. She had to decide if she would allow Andrew to meet Ethan, and more importantly, she had to gauge whether Ethan was ready for that. Ethan sat back in his chair, his small hands resting in his lap, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the kitchen. He had always been a thoughtful child, sensitive and kind, but this revelation had clearly shaken him. The boy who had been so full of laughter just moments before now seemed quiet, almost solemn. "Mom," he said softly, breaking the silence, "why didn't you tell me before?" Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had known this question was coming, but it didn't make answering it any easier. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "I didn't want to hurt you, honey," she said gently. "When you were little, it didn't seem like the right time. And as you got older, I wanted to protect you from things I wasn't sure you were ready to hear. I thought we had more time." Ethan looked down at his hands, his brow furrowed in thought. So, Andrew is my real dad. Sarah's heart clenched at the word real, but she nodded. Yes, he's your biological father. But Mark has been here for you, every day of your life. He's been your dad in every way that matters. Ethan glanced at Mark, and for a moment, his eyes filled with tears. You're still my dad, right? He asked, his voice wavering. Mark reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand in his. I will always be your dad, Ethan, he said firmly, his voice filled with emotion. That's never going to change. Not now, not ever. Ethan blinked, trying to keep his tears at bay, but one slipped down his cheek. I don't want anything to change, he whispered. Sarah's heart broke at the vulnerability in her son's voice, and she wrapped her arms around him again, holding him tightly. Nothing has to change, sweetie, she whispered. We'll take things slow. You don't have to meet Andrew if you're not ready. Ethan pulled back slightly, looking up at her with wide, questioning eyes. Do you think I should meet him? Sarah's breath caught in her throat. How could she answer that? On one hand, she believed Ethan deserved to know his biological father, to have the opportunity to form his own opinion of Andrew. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the fear that Andrew's reappearance might disrupt the stability and happiness Ethan had known for so long. I think it's up to you, Sarah said softly, choosing her words carefully. If you want to meet him, I'll make sure it happens. But if you're not ready, that's okay too. This is your decision, Ethan. Ethan was silent for a long moment, his young mind working to process the enormity of the situation. Finally, he looked up at her, his voice small and uncertain. I think I want to meet him, just to see what he's like. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy but relieved that Ethan was able to voice his feelings. Okay, she said softly. We'll take it one step at a time. Andrew's anticipation. Across town, in the sterile, impersonal confines of his hotel room, Andrew Patterson sat staring at his phone, waiting for a message or a call that would determine the course of the rest of his life. His stomach churned with nerves, and he hadn't been able to sleep for days. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leaked into his throat, but it was always business emails or a missed call from Vanessa, whom he had neglected to contact since his return to Chicago. Vanessa. He hadn't even thought about her since the moment he saw Sarah and Ethan at the airport. His marriage to Vanessa, like everything else in his life, had been born from his pursuit of success and material wealth. Vanessa was glamorous, ambitious, and had connections that had helped Andrew climb the ladder of success. But in all the years they had been together, he had never felt the deep, soulful connection that he had once shared with Sarah. That was the irony of it all. He had left Sarah for a life he thought he wanted, only to realize too late that the very thing he had been searching for was what he had left behind. Now, everything hinged on one decision. Sarah's decision. And more than that, Ethan's decision. The son he had never met. The boy who had grown up without him. His phone buzzed, and Andrew's heart skipped a beat. He reached for it with trembling fingers, and when he saw Sarah's name flash across the screen, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Sarah, Ethan wants to meet you. We'll take it slow. Can you come by tomorrow? Andrew stared at the message, his mind spinning. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to meet his son. But now that the opportunity was in front of him, he felt an overwhelming wave of anxiety. How would Ethan react to him? What would he say? How could he explain the choices he had made, the years he had lost? He typed out a quick response, agreeing to the time and place Sarah suggested, and then set the phone down, his hands trembling. Tomorrow, he would meet his son for the first time. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. The meeting. The next day dawned bright and clear, but Andrew's nerves were anything but calm. He arrived early at the park where Sarah had suggested they meet, a small, quiet place on the edge of town, far away from the bustle of the city. It was a place where they could talk without the pressure of crowds, where Ethan would hopefully feel more comfortable. Andrew's heart pounded as he sat on a bench near the playground, watching children laugh and play, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the tension knotting in his stomach. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 1,000 times in his head, but now that the moment was approaching, his mind was blank. He spotted Sarah first, walking toward him from across the park, her face unreadable but composed, and beside her, holding her hand, was Ethan. Andrew's breath caught in his throat at the sight of the boy. He looked so much like Andrew had at that age. The same messy blonde hair, the same green eyes. It was like looking into a mirror from the past, and yet there was something in Ethan's posture, in the way he held himself, that reminded Andrew of Sarah, a quiet strength, a resilience that made his heart ache with both pride and regret. As they approached, Andrew stood up, his legs feeling like jelly beneath him. He had imagined this moment so many times, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. "Hi," Sarah said softly, her voice steady but cautious. She glanced at Ethan, who was standing close beside her, his eyes wide and curious. Andrew swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "Hi, Sarah." "Hi, Ethan." Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Andrew, his eyes studying him, as if trying to piece together who this man was. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Are you really my dad?" Andrew's throat tightened, and he crouched down so he was at eye level with Ethan. His heart ached with the weight of the question, with the truth of the years he had missed. "Yes, Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your biological father. I know I haven't been there, and I know I've missed a lot, but I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me." Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Andrew's heart pounded in his chest, waiting, hoping. He had no idea what Ethan was thinking, no idea how the boy would react. But then, slowly, Ethan nodded. "Okay," he said simply. Andrew felt a surge of relief, but he knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much to say, so much to explain. But for now, just having the chance to be here, to stand in front of his son, and see those green eyes looking back at him, was more than he had dared to hope for. Sarah watched the exchange, her face softening just slightly, as if she too was relieved by the tentative connection forming between father and son. She had agreed to let them meet, but she was still cautious, still protective of Ethan. Andrew knew he would have to prove himself, not just to Sarah, but to Ethan as well. The three of them sat down on the park bench, and Andrew began to talk, slowly, carefully, about his past, about his mistakes, about how much he regretted not being there.